Всім добрий вечір.
On behalf of the brave, on behalf of every father and every mother, wings for freedom. On behalf of our warriors, and paves the way for a new history.
Hello and welcome to Tochnyi Weekly, the show that gets behind the headlines to discuss the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have a new intro with 100% less violence, looking pretty good. Really excited about that. Thanks so much to our designer, Chris, for working on the new intro. Please, if you could, hit the like button and the subscribe button on the old YouTube. Really helps us out. We just want to spread the word to more people. So yeah, if you could do the same for us. We also have a presence on Twitter and Blue Sky, so you can subscribe to us there if you want some updates. And if you could, spread the word about us on other social media platforms that we're less active on. Lastly, we do have a website, tochnyi.info. Feel free to check that out. There's a lot of great research on there from all of our research team. There's lots of interactive maps and all kinds of technical information that you might be interested in. So we have an excellent broadcast for you today. First, I'll be presenting the news. Then German Aid to Ukraine has sent in a video of his report because he's, I think, watching some debates in the German elections, something to that effect. So yeah, he won't be joining us directly, but he did leave his report. Then we will be joined by our guest, Mr. Fabian Hoffmann, who we've had on the program before. He's an expert in strategy and nuclear issues in Europe, and he's here to talk to us a little bit about some stuff Erlend wanted to talk about. So that'll be an excellent discussion between Erlend and our guest. And I think that's all we've got on the agenda for today. We'll, of course, have a Q&A at the end. So if you guys have any questions in the chat, or I guess, after the broadcast in the comments, if you want to leave any questions, go ahead and feel free to submit them. We'll do our best to answer them either during this broadcast if you're in the live audience, or maybe in the next show if you're not, or in the comments. So thanks again to our audience, and I'll jump into the news. These are the main headlines as of February 16th, 2025. Up first, we have operations. Ukrainian emergency team successfully extinguished a fire at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant's protective shelter covering the damaged Unit 4 following a Russian drone attack on February 14th. The shelter, designed to contain radiation from the 1986 nuclear disaster, was compromised, but radiation levels remain stable and within normal limits, as confirmed by the Ukrainian Ministry of Internal Affairs. President Zelensky addressed the situation on Telegram and condemned the attack as deliberate, noting the strategic low-altitude flight of the drone at 85 meters to avoid radar detection, and stressed the significance of the shelter, which was the result of international efforts involving Europe, the United States, and other global partners committed to genuine security measures. Ukraine's automated systems continue to monitor radiation levels across 39 points in the exclusion zone, with the capability to provide updates from hourly to minute by minute in emergency situations, ensuring a prompt and accurate assessment as confirmed by Ukraine's Minister of Environmental Protection. On the night of February 11th, Ukrainian drones targeted key facilities in Russia's Saratov Oblast, striking a major oil refinery and causing explosions near a military airbase, according to reports from both Ukrainian and Russian officials and corroborated by local sources. The Saratov oil refinery, operated by Rosneft and known for its significant processing capacity of 7 million tons of oil annually, was set ablaze. Concurrently, residents in the nearby town of Engels, where Russia's strategic bomber base and its oil supply depot are situated, experienced multiple explosions. The governor of Saratov acknowledged the damage to an industrial facility, but suggested it resulted from drone debris rather than a direct strike. Where have I heard that before? The Russian Defense Ministry reported intercepting 40 drones across 5 regions on that night, including 18 in Saratov alone. Local accounts from Saratov described the chaos of the night, with residents reporting that explosions caused the windows to rattle, car alarms to go off, and they shared videos online capturing sounds of drone engines, gunfire, and searchlight scanning for drones. Significant explosions were also reported around the Engels 2 military airfield in the town of Engels, which houses Tu-95MS and Tu-160 strategic bombers used in missile attacks against Ukraine. The recent strike follows a similar attack on the same refinery on January 14th, which also targeted the Engels 2 airfield infrastructure and the Ros Reserve Crystal Fuel Depot, causing fires and damage to facilities storing scarce aviation fuel. Vertska media in Russia has reported that Russian army officers are aggressively pushing draftees who have been active in combat since 2022 to sign professional contracts with the Defense Ministry. The investigation was supported by interviews with several soldiers currently stationed in Ukraine, their spouses, and numerous discussions in Telegram chat groups. Draftees who resist signing the contracts are threatened with reassignment to frontline assault units where their chances of survival are slim, and they are given only a few hours to make the decision. According to the reports, the pressure tactics vary. Some soldiers are offered contracts under fair conditions, while others are coerced with threats of dangerous reassignments. The wife of one soldier noted that refusing the offers can lead to undesirable deployments regardless of one's official status, and she described the contacts as a trap that soldiers find difficult to escape once signed. Officers are under pressure to meet recruitment quotas, which influences their aggressive tactics in securing contracts, often leading to inflated and possibly deceptive reporting of recruitment figures. Soldiers who sign service contracts forfeit the significant one-time payment that civilian volunteers also receive. The overall decline in willingness to enlist has been significant, with recruitment numbers in Moscow dropping from 250 volunteers per day to just 40. Many who resist signing express concerns not only about being deployed in Ukraine, but potentially indefinitely to other conflicts around the world. Ukrainian cyber experts have successfully carried out a significant cyber attack on Russia's energy sector, according to a report from Ukrinform, citing a source within Ukraine's intelligence agency, HUR. The major cyber operation impacted 23 Russian companies, including Gazprom's main contractor, Gazstroyprom, and its subsidiaries that are integral to the construction and maintenance of Russia's oil and gas infrastructure. The operation occurred over February 7th through 8th and resulted in extensive disruptions. The source from HUR revealed that the attacks had been part of a broader campaign that started in 2022, with over 100 large-scale cyber attacks launched against various Russian targets, ranging from government websites to critical sectors like nuclear weapons development. The operation reportedly caused losses amounting to several billion rubles for the affected Russian companies. The successful execution of the cyber attack was facilitated through the cooperation of an executive from the targeted holding company who provided Ukraine's defense forces with access to crucial servers, thus exploiting existing vulnerabilities in Russia's cybersecurity defenses. As a result of the operation, more than 120 servers and over 1,500 virtual machines were disabled. File storage with more than 2 million gigabytes of documentation was destroyed, and upwards of 10,000 employee computers were rendered inoperative, leading to a complete shutdown of all systems and services for the impacted companies. On the morning of February 9th, an explosion in the engine room of the oil tanker Koala at the Ust-Luga port in the northwest of Russia led to an emergency evacuation of its crew, as reported by Russia's Federal Agency for Sea and Inland Water Transport via telegram. The vessel, docked at a port west of St. Petersburg, experienced significant damage, although it was confirmed that there was no risk of the tanker sinking, and importantly, no oil spill or leakage from its cargo occurred. Authorities are investigating the cause of the explosion, but have not provided any specifics yet. The Koala, a tanker flying the Antigua and Barbuda flag, was built in 2023 and had docked at the port on February 6th after being tracked by Vessel Finder. According to reports, it was transporting 130,000 tons of heavy fuel oil. The incident adds to a recent pattern of mishaps involving tankers, including 2 that were severely damaged in the Black Sea in December, which led to a substantial fuel spill that affected coastal areas. So normally I would put that in economy, but there was an explosion, so it felt like it belonged there. Up next we have economy and aid. Norwegian Defense Minister Tore Anshu Sandvik, how to do Erlend, recently announced Norway's joining of the Drone Coalition, a group focusing on supporting Ukraine with drones during the war with Russia. Norway has allocated 700 million Norwegian kroners to a multinational initiative dedicated to purchasing drones for Ukraine, with plans in 2025 to utilize additional funds from the non-send drone and drone technology programs. Norway is already heavily involved in the capability coalitions. It co-leads the Maritime Security Coalition with the UK and participates in the Air Defense Coalition led by Germany and France. Ukroboronprom, a key defense manufacturer, and Thales International SAS, a French firm specializing in aerospace and defense information systems, have recently formalized a joint venture agreement. Announced at the Munich Security Conference, the collaboration aims to enhance technological advancements and responsive support in several critical defense areas, including air defense, radar, electronic warfare, tactical communications, and electro-optical systems. Ole Huliak, CEO of Ukroboronprom, highlighted that the partnership is strategically important for Ukraine as it bolsters the nation's defense capabilities against Russian military threats and enriches the Ukrainian defense sector with cutting-edge technology and expertise. Thales is a group known for its global reach and specialization in information systems applicable to aerospace, defense, and maritime sectors. It's headquartered in Paris. The new joint venture builds on a foundation laid in June 2024 when Thales signed 3 agreements with Ukrainian defense entities to collaborate on projects involving EW, air defense, radar, and drones. The UK has recently unveiled a new surface-to-air missile system called Gravehawk, specifically designed to bolster Ukraine's defenses against aerial threats such as drones, cruise missiles, and aircraft. Developed by a specialized team within the UK Ministry of Defence known as Task Force Kindred, the system was produced in just 18 months at a development cost of £6 million. The Gravehawk system incorporates the Soviet-era R-73 air-to-air missile, which has been modified for launch from a ground-based system. The missile is capable of engaging targets up to 40 kilometers away, depending on the variant, and is widely used in the Ukrainian Air Force, making it a sensible choice for integration due to its availability and established utility. Housed in a standard ISO transport container, the Gravehawk system is designed for ease of transport and rapid deployment via truck, train, or ship. The containerization also facilitates discrete movement and swift setup in various operational contexts. The system is operated by a crew of 5 and includes an advanced optical station that uses passive infrared radiation to detect targets based solely on their heat signatures. The feature ensures that the system doesn't emit radar signals, which reduces its visibility to enemy forces. The optical outputs are managed from a compact command module, which is portable and the size of a briefcase, allowing for mobile and flexible command operations. Currently, the Ukrainian Armed Forces have received 2 units of the Gravehawk system, with plans to deliver an additional 15 units by the end of the year. Each system is priced at about £1 million, with Denmark contributing to half the funding for each unit. Also, the UK has committed to significantly enhancing its defense support to Ukraine with a new aid package announced by UK Defense Secretary John Healey. During the commencement of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group meeting in Brussels, Healey declared the UK's provision of an additional £150 million worth of military support. The package includes tanks, artillery, and air-to-air missiles, alongside new contracts aimed at the maintenance and repair of equipment previously supplied. Healey is chairing the Ramstein meeting in Brussels for the first time, and his remarks emphasize broader implications of the war in Ukraine, asserting that the nation's security is intrinsically linked to global security. The Netherlands is set to provide Ukraine with 25 YPR tracked armored vehicles designed for evacuating the wounded, announced by the Dutch Defense Minister. The Dutch Defense Minister also noted that in collaboration with the Czech Republic and the United States, the partner nations had fulfilled their promise of delivering the last of the T-72 battle tanks previously pledged to Ukraine. According to a recent report by the Financial Times, Russia's military spending experienced a significant surge in 2024, increasing 42% to reach 13.1 trillion rubles, which is approximately $462 billion when adjusted for purchasing power parity. The increase in spending has resulted in Russia's military budget surpassing the combined defense expenditures of all European Union nations plus the United Kingdom. Combined, these countries increased their defense spending by around 12% in 2024, totaling about $457 billion. The International Institute for Strategic Studies, which provided the data for the report, also forecasts a continued rise in Russian military expenditures. It projects an increase of 13.7% for 2025, which would bring Russia's defense spending to about 15.6 trillion rubles, or roughly $166 billion. In comparison, among the European nations, Germany led in defense spending in absolute terms with $86 billion, followed by the UK at $81 billion and France at $64 billion. Relative to their GDPs, Estonia and Poland were the leaders in military spending percentages at 4% and 3.25% respectively. However, their total expenditures, $1.7 billion for Estonia and $28 billion for Poland, were significantly lower than those of the larger European economies. An investigative report by Schemes, a unit of Radio Liberty, revealed that despite Western sanctions, around 24 Chinese companies are supplying Russia with crucial materials such as gallium, germanium, and antimony, which are important for the manufacturing of military equipment. The minerals are integral for producing components like drones, missiles, and night vision goggles. The Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project highlighted that at least a third of these Chinese suppliers are partially state-owned. Notably, China was identified as the sole foreign supplier of gallium and germanium to Russia in 2023 and continues to be the primary supplier of antimony. The report pinpointed companies such as Yunnan Linkong Xinyuan, Germanium Industry, and Vital Technology Group, which have significant stakes held by members of the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese state structures. These Chinese firms are channeling minerals to major Russian defense players like Rostec, a state-owned conglomerate responsible for supplying approximately 80% of the weaponry used by Russia in Ukraine. The flow of materials occurs despite global sanctions, suggesting that bilateral trade between Chinese and Russian companies in these sectors has not been directly hindered by Western sanctions. The investigation also uncovered that Ferrotech Nord, a Russian subsidiary of a Japanese company, has been importing antimony from China and supplying silicon wafers to Russian military microelectronics manufacturers. Another concern is that some of these materials might be reaching Russia's nuclear weapons industry through transactions with Cryotrade Engineering, a Russian company receiving gallium from China's Heinhe Technology Limited. Experts like Tetiana Solomacha from the Kyiv Aviation Institute and Anton Pabuda from Lab 41 emphasized the critical role the minerals play in military technology. Vladislav Vlasyuk, a sanctions policy commissioner for Ukrainian President Zelensky, noted that direct cooperation between Chinese and Russian firms insulates them from the impact of Western sanctions. And finally, we have international relations. In a significant cooperative law enforcement effort named Operation Avengers, Ukrainian and Moldovan authorities have successfully apprehended 3 Moldovan nationals who previously fought for the Wagner Group, a Russian state-backed private military company. These individuals participated in major military operations, including the notorious Battle for Bakhmut in Donetsk. Their participation spanned from key conflicts at the Donetsk airport to the encirclement of Debaltseve between 2014 and 2023, serving not only in Wagner but also in the Somali Battalion and other units under Russian command. The Wagner Group has been consistently implicated in severe war crimes in Ukraine, which has been intensifying since 2022. The joint operation saw the participation of over 200 officers from Ukraine's National Police, Moldova's Interior Ministry, and supported by Europol, utilized a virtual command post to enhance real-time intelligence exchange and cross-reference data within Europol systems. During the operation's initial phase, authorities executed 50 searches, which led to the confiscation of various items such as documents and electronic devices that provided evidence of the detainees' roles in combat and their associations with the Wagner Group. The Moldovan authorities charged the 3 captured individuals under their national laws against mercenary activities with potential sentences of up to 10 years in prison. The operation has also set the stage for broader investigations, as the Ukrainian police have identified 85 more Moldovan nationals suspected of fighting alongside Russian forces. The information has been shared with Moldovan law enforcement for further action. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have successfully completed their disconnection from Russia's energy system, marking a significant step in their energy independence and further integration into European infrastructure. The development was confirmed by European Pravda, citing a statement from Estonia's Foreign Affairs Ministry. The disconnection was executed on Saturday, the 8th of February 2025, following previous commitments by the Baltic states to sever their energy ties with Russia. Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Šahkna heralded the event as a historic day for European integration. The plan to disconnect and synchronize with ENTSO-E was officially confirmed by the energy ministers of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania back in July of 2024, with a targeted completion date of February of 2025. Until this disconnection, the Baltic states, along with Russia and Belarus, were part of a centrally managed electricity supply system based in Moscow. Since May 2022, all 3 Baltic countries had ceased importing electricity from Russia, which laid the groundwork for the full separation. And last item this week, President Zelensky has decided against a U.S. proposal that would grant Washington approximately 50% ownership of Ukraine's rare earth minerals, as reported by the Financial Times. Zelensky's rejection stemmed from concerns over the absence of explicit security guarantees from the United States within the proposed deal. During a meeting in Kyiv with Scott Bessent, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, a document was presented that required Zelensky's signature before Bessent's return to Washington. The document was described by Bessent as an economic agreement aimed at deepening economic ties between the U.S. and Ukraine, purportedly offering a, quote, long-term security shield for all Ukrainians. However, Ukrainian officials have expressed reservations, noting that the proposed agreement lacks specific commitments on future U.S. security guarantees, which are critical to Ukraine, especially in light of the ongoing hostilities. The deal was characterized by one official as typical of, quote, Trump deal-making, implying a hard bargain with potentially unequal benefits. Concerns were particularly pointed regarding the agreement's failure to link the mineral rights to broader security assurances from the U.S. and its allies. The stipulation that disputes over mineral rights would be adjudicated in New York courts added another layer of controversy, signaling a potential loss of legal sovereignty for Ukraine in those matters. In response, Ukrainian authorities are reportedly seeking to renegotiate the terms to secure a more favorable outcome that aligns with the country's security needs and sovereignty aspirations. And that's it for the main headlines this week. We'll now move to the next segment.
Hello guys, as always I will now present this week's most important news from Germany regarding Ukraine. We start with an update shared by Rheinmetall on Monday. The German defense giant made the delivery of a further 5 Caracal air assault vehicles to Ukraine public. These vehicles are in use with the Ukrainian special forces and are part of the ongoing deliveries to Ukraine financed by the German government. This brings the total number of Caracals delivered to 20, with 5 more to follow in the near future. And last but not least, I know, just a little segment. On Friday, the German drone manufacturer Quantum Systems announced in a press release that they will double the production capacity of their Kyiv-based production facility over the course of this year to meet the growing demands in Ukraine. Quantum Systems supplies state-of-the-art Vector eVTOL UAVs to the Ukrainian armed forces since early 2022, most of them financed by the German government. For 2025, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense asked the German Ministry of Defense for at least 800 additional Vector eVTOL UAVs, each drone system worth around 200,000 euros. And that's already it for my segment, so back to you, Joseph.
Well, thank you, Mr. German Aid to Ukraine. So I believe we have our guest here, Erlend. So I guess I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you. Welcome so much back to the stream, Fabian. How are you doing?
Yeah, doing very well, thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, perfectly.
Excellent.
So Fabian, you're still working at your doctorate at the University of Oslo, right?
Yes, until April 2026, until the war is going to interrupt us, then probably a bit longer.
Okay.
Getting right into it.
We have
on a
to
very optimistic tone.
We have to arrange a coffee or something with some of the other people. Still haven't gotten around to do that yet, but
Before it's
happy
late,
to have you in my
on
city, man. Well, so I invited you because I think you have a lot of interesting perspectives on some of the things that have happened during the last week, which has been rather turbulent. Personally, I wouldn't say that I didn't expect any of these things that have come out from the United States, but when they all happen, basically all these statements and plans that they have presented basically are laid out in 1 week. It's kind of overwhelming. So I thought we could frame this as why a forced peace deal would be an absolutely terrible idea, not just for Ukraine, but also for Europe. And then I thought we could also go in a little bit into detail of how an imagined peace mission would look like, and why it's fairly unrealistic that Europe can actually commit to that. But I'll just ask you, why is it such a bad idea for Europe? And then we can probably go into Ukraine a little bit later.
Yeah, so let's start with what happened, right? What you just mentioned over this last week or so. And Over the last 2 years, I would say I was constantly one of the people in Europe that painted these worst case scenarios. And I think as a European, especially as a German, I think we've really lost the ability to think in worst case scenarios. I think it was a bit easier for me because I come from nuclear strategy field, right? So we constantly think about nuclear related issues in terms of worst case outcomes and worst case scenarios, and what are the bleakest developments that can occur that lead us to total Armageddon. But this week we've seen why it's important to think about these types of developments also in worst case scenarios, because I think one of those just has happened. And again, it's shocking that our decision makers are as ill prepared as they currently are. It's not like we didn't have months and in fact years to prepare for an outcome like this, where Europe is it looks like going to be fully alone with the situation in Ukraine. In the best case, in the worst case, even the United States is actively going over our heads and potentially at a somewhat later stage collaborating with Russia more than with us. I think that's absolutely out there as an option right now, and this is again the baseline planning I would advocate for. We do right now, and that means the strongest possible measures. I mean, why is it a bad deal? Because in the end, right, if you have something like a forced peace deal where Ukraine loses everything, Russia maybe does not win everything, but at least doesn't get punished, you will have rewarded Russia's imperial ambitions while not sufficiently weakened it. That is a perfect recipe for a follow-on war in Ukraine, where Russia will try to gain full political control over Kyiv, or at least get even more territorial control over non-occupied territory at this point. And then I think there's also a fairly high likelihood that with the United States leaving the European continent, even if it does not fully withdraw from NATO, I think it's pretty clear right now that in an Article 5 scenario, United States may not necessarily come to our aid. That means we're alone with Russia. And that means Russia would have every incentive to challenge this NATO Article 5. Right? Not in the sense that they would want to take the Baltics or Finland or whatnot, right? It would really not be about territorial control in such a NATO-Russia contingency. It would much more be about politically destroying NATO and Article 5 commitment once and for all. Because in the end, right, you would have, and that's what the Russians would speculate, is that without the United States, you would have a scattered response in Europe. You would not really have leadership. States like France, Germany, UK would not amass sufficient forces and fast enough to come to the aid of the Baltic allies or other Eastern European and Northern European allies. And hence, the alliance as such is done with. And then, of course, that gives Russia carte blanche for future scenarios where they can just, satisfy all their imperial ambitions.
Yeah. So one thing I want to ask you: why is it actually such a big threat? Why is Russia such a big threat in a very short period of time? Because I remember, was it a year ago? You said 2 to 3 years, and now you're saying
1 to 2 years. Absolutely.
1 to 2 years.
Yeah.
But everyone is saying that Russia needs like 5 years to rearm itself to its former strength. But why is that short timeline something that you emphasize so much?
Yeah, so those scenarios where Russia gives us 5 to 7 years, that's a scenario where we assume that before Russia would challenge us, they would try to regain their former strength as what they had prior to the war in Ukraine. And I think that's wrong on two dimensions. First of all, on a material level, I think even within 7 years, even within 9 years, Russia is not going to get back to its former strength. I mean, the manpower is lost. It's tremendous. The deep stocks and reserves from Soviet times, they are pretty much exhausted. It's not going to get that back. Russia is not producing enough, even with the war economy working on full throttle. It's right, like those arsenals are not going to rebuild themselves. But here's the kicker: Russia also doesn't need that. Russia does not, in order to confront us and challenge NATO Article 5, right? Again, it's not about steamrolling NATO and European NATO from Tallinn to Lisbon. That's not the goal. It's about challenging NATO Article 5 and prove to NATO allies in the East that those political commitments given to them by Western, especially Western European allies, but also others, that they're worthless. And Russia can achieve that without taking full control of major parts of NATO territory, right? And I've outlined those scenarios, which I think are quite likely in that regard, and actually which, did not emerge in my head, but it's if you study Russian literature on military strategy, on how they think they can defeat us, because they've always planned, right, for exactly this scenario where they're materially inferior, because they know that in the end, right, Europe is materially a lot stronger than Russia is and ever can be. So they have come up with strategies and plans to defeat us within this state of material inferiority. One thing they could do, for example, is amass enough troops to take a substantial part of the Baltic's territory, right? Don't know exactly how much, but substantial enough that it's, let's say, more than a couple of kilometers. Then, right, you take that part of the territory, then you escalate, you launch massive missile salvos against Western European states, Northern European states, Southern European states. You tell the population of these states that as long as they resist Russia, the suffering, the pain that they experience is only going to increase. It's not going to get better from here. Right? From day one, the civilian population in major NATO population centers is directly affected. And then Russia is going to send out the message that any NATO attempt, right, any attempt from Western European allies, like Germany, like France, like the UK, like Poland, to kick out the Russians from this strip of Baltic territory that they have taken, would result in nuclear escalation. And then you're going to look at Berlin right now, right, the chancellor that we have in Berlin right now, or you look at some other European leaders. Do you seriously believe that they would not, maybe not directly falter, but that they would be extremely steadfast at their response and just ignore this Russian threat and go full into the Baltics to kick out the Russians? I mean, that's what the Russians are speculating on, right? That like there's enough hesitation to then destroy this NATO Article 5 political commitment. And the last point here, right? Because that's then always where people say, oh, Fabian, but that's so unrealistic, right? Like, the Russians, they could never do that, and they would never do that, and NATO is strong enough. And the thing is, that's great if you believe that that's the case. And I also, honestly, I also believe that, being a German, I have serious doubts about my government right now. But I do believe that if push comes to shove, a majority of German society would stand behind its Eastern European allies. But in the end, it does not matter what I think, right? That's completely irrelevant. Maybe my grandma cares about that. But in the end, the only ones that we have to convince in the room are the Russians themselves. Right? The Russians have to understand that if they try such a scenario, if they go in with this attempt to force out NATO Article 5 commitment and make us fail, that they themselves would fail at doing that. And quite honestly, I do not believe that we're doing a very good job at this right now. And that's why I'm extremely concerned about the situation.
Yeah, so what we would have to do is to actually pose such a threat for this kind of scenario that you're proposing that Russia doesn't even want to try it. Right?
It's not about us presenting a threat. It's about us deterring Russia, right? And that's about creating a denial capability, right? I think we have, for example, we have to deny like this initial land gain by Russia. Basically, this is the type of forward defense that NATO always talked about in the pre-war years as being highly unrealistic, right? This idea that, we would, the Baltics are lost anyways, and basically it's not about defending the Baltics. It's about counterattacking through Poland to regain the territory. I think those times are over. I really think, if NATO, and especially Europe is serious about its survival, then we have to start thinking about establishing this type of forward defense where we're not going to give in a single inch, right? Where we defend the Baltics and Romania and Poland and other frontline states at the border, right? We're not going to give in. We're not even going to give Russia this opportunity to create these coercive leverage scenarios where they believe they could get away with threatening us into submission.
Yeah, because basically what we've learned from the war in Ukraine is that whenever Russia is managed to capture a territory, it is extremely difficult to kick them out again, right? So let's just look at the scenario where the front line is frozen more or less around these the ones that we have today. And what do you think Russia is going to do? They have a formidable force, at least numerous, in the occupied territories, but also in the adjacent territories inside Russia. What do you think they're going to do with them, and why are they a threat to other Eastern European countries like, I guess, Romania, the Baltics, and also Finland, Norway, and maybe even Sweden?
I mean, so if you look at Ukraine, my assessment of the situation is that neither Ukraine nor Russia can make major territorial gains. I think this war then will be decided. It is an attritional war at this point, right? It's about who can stay in longer. And I'm still fully convinced that if Europe puts its full weight behind Ukraine and finally starts mobilizing its defense industries to a sufficient extent, that it is has a lot more endurance than Russia. But if that doesn't happen, if we leave Ukraine alone, then indeed it is quite. It could be quite a bleak future. I mean, yeah, there are reserves on Russia's side. But I mean, right now, at this very moment, I think most Russian forces, basically all of them, are concentrated in Ukraine. I also don't believe that right now, in this very moment, or tomorrow or next month, the Russians would start something, right? That's why I say in a worst case scenario, we have to be prepared in a year from now, or 1.5 years, or 2 years, or something like that, right? Because I do believe that Russia, they would not go blindly into this type of risk, right? Which still attacking NATO and challenging NATO Article 5, that is a risk for the Russians. They would not blindly rush into that. So I think there would be, some time where they can recuperate some forces, do some planning, and then it becomes really dangerous. I think right now, if you ask me specifically in this moment, I think Russia is almost fully committed on, or pretty much fully committed on Ukraine.
But let's take the scenario where some sort of deal or ceasefire is made, and Russia pulls out half of its fighting force, reconstitutes it somewhere in Russia, and continue its production of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, drones, etc. Will Europe, in 1 to 2 years from now, be able to even build up to being able to actually stop them at the border, right? Let's take the Baltic scenario. Not let them 1 inch in. Would European forces be able to do that in 1 to 2 years from now?
Well, look, do I think within 1 or 2 years we can build up all the forces that I would like us to have? I don't think so. But the neat thing about deterrence, right? This is a good quote from the Cold War. You only need 5% certainty to deter your adversary and 95% certainty to reassure your allies, right? That's the issue that the United States was dealing with during the Cold War. That basically, you had to explain West Germany in full detail how exactly you would defend them and why, a defense is airtight. But the Soviets were probably deterred by much less certainty. I think we're kind of dealing the same with that, right? I don't think we have to build an airtight case that 100% we can establish this forward line of defense, which, in all honesty, right, we could have gotten there if we had made serious preparations years ago. But that train has left the station. What we can still do if we go in a very determined way right now, right, and really do what is needed to also get our capital intensive industry started and build tanks and IFVs and planes and whatnot at scale and missiles, then I think we are in a position where we can build on the Russian side sufficient levels of uncertainty, right? Uncertainty in the sense that they don't know for sure if it's going to be worth it, if the risk is going to pay off, that they would hesitate and would not go through with it. So I'm more optimistic about deterring Russia rather than defending the scenario that I just outlined once that scenario is in play. And again, right, this is really a good case to make for why we should deter Russia rather than fight a war with them.
But isn't deterring Russia a lot more effective if we actually fully commit to Ukrainian defense and also supporting them right now? Because
for sure it is, right? That's also what I said, that I think right now Russia is fully committed to Ukraine, and as long as we make sure that Russia is fully committed to Ukraine, I think we buy ourselves more time. Again, I think Russia would want to have some type of breathing room. Doesn't mean like a complete end to the fighting. It could, for example, be a significant slowdown in the intensity, or it could be some types of precarious peace deal or something like that. I think the Russians would want some type of breathing room. Of course, I can't look into the heads of decision makers. So the longer or the more time we buy us in Ukraine, and the more we support the Ukrainians, that they can effectively fight the Russians and ideally still defeat them, which I still think is totally possible if we do what is necessary. Then we could, right? That is one option of making sure that the Russians are not going to become a threat to us. And the other point is, right, deterrence is material capability and what we call resolve. The willingness to remain steadfast if push comes to shove. Like, that's how I explain it in a bit more layman's terms. So basically, and we do that by signaling to Russia that we're willing to take risks, that we are willing to accept risks to our own societies, that we are more pain tolerant than the Russians assume we are right now. And the best way we do that, of course, is by putting our full support behind Ukraine, even if that means that we accept some residual risks to ourselves. And this is going to make an impression with the Russians, right? They're not going to just see that and ignore that. If we show to them that we are resolved actors, they will take that into account in their planning. So I think we have an excellent case to make that at this point still the best defense or the best way to deter Russia is through Ukraine. If that fails, we have to be ready within a year or two.
And one of those deterring or the determinations from Europe could be demonstrated by, for instance, deploying forces in Ukraine already before you start about talking about a peace deal or ceasefire, right? For instance, there's been proposals of having training missions somewhere in the east of in the west of Ukraine, and there's also been talks about deploying some sort of force in Kyiv as a sort of demonstration that we are going to make sure or stand by Ukraine and make sure that Kyiv survives in any sort of escalation further than this. I mean, this week we've heard Ukraine saying that the Russians are planning another attack from Belarus, etc. So that could definitely be a very, very strong signal to Russia, right?
That would be a signal, right? That's what I just said. That that's what we as Europeans have to be clear about, is that if we go in there, right, if we put troops into Ukraine, especially at the border, there is a real risk that would draw us into the conflict. There is a real risk that will make us end up in a shooting fight with the Russians. So we shouldn't downplay that. But there may be the point, and maybe that point has come now, maybe it will come in 6 months or 12 or later, where we have to do that, right? Where we believe that the risks of not taking that decision are outweighing the risks of going in. And if that point has come, then definitely we have to go in. And if we then signal that correctly to the Russians, right, I think then it also takes a bit of broader diplomatic military efforts also outside of Ukraine, then that would be or could be a very effective way of signaling this type of resolve that I've talked about to the Russians.
And that may be some of the things that Macron has tried to do
Yeah,
with his.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, but then instead of actually doing it, it's been mostly empty words, and
Yeah,
that's
and
kind of
the
a
problem
problem.
is that you have people like, I mean, especially Scholz and Biden back then, who immediately saw the risk of doing that as outweighing the risk of a Ukrainian defeat, right? I mean, that's always what it comes down to. Do we think whatever costs a Ukrainian defeat would impose on ourselves, does that outweigh the risk of potentially getting drawn into the war? And I think Macron has tried to bring up that discussion that, you know, a Ukrainian defeat would be incredibly costly, and that potentially we have to take certain risks in order to make sure that this type of future does not materialize. But you have Scholz and Biden back in the days who immediately shut that down, right? For them, the worst case scenario was not Ukrainian defeat, but entering into war with Russia. And that's why that type of thing hasn't materialized, and we just have to see how it continues in the future. I mean, I do believe that a Ukrainian defeat would pose an existential threat to our way of life, and also, you know, territorially to some of our Eastern European allies. So, you know, I think averting that type of risk justifies taking on substantial risk.
Yeah, and that may that's something I may agree with you on, that it poses a threat not just to us physically and kinetically, but also on the long term, our
Yeah.
way of life, our democracy, and our system being completely eradicated over time, because that's one of Russia's strengths, right? So
I mean, this is it, right? Like, this is either Europe stands up now, or in the best case scenario, we fade into irrelevance, or we become, you know, this pushover actor between the United States and Russia. So, you know, this is do or die. like, you know, live or lay down, Europe.
and then what risk are you willing to take to make sure that doesn't happen? And in my opinion, that the threshold should be relatively high, because we're talking about basically everything that we care and love about. So in our societies, right?
Yeah,
Freedom,
yeah. I mean, I will
democracy.
say, right, you know, this is the one thing, you know, that if we have to confront the Russians alone, I think if the Americans are out of the equation, it looks conventionally, of course, it's a lot worse for us. I think the nuclear escalation risks are quite substantially reduced, actually. So I think I think with the Americans out, the likelihood that we have to fight a large scale conventional war rises tremendously. But the risk that this war escalates to the strategic nuclear level, meaning counter city targeting, I think that paradoxically reduces.
Huh. Interesting. Well, I guess we can start moving on to a little bit different topic, and but before that, if some of the other people in the panel has comments or questions, maybe you can throw them out right now.
I had one thought about the earlier comment about deterrence. What's what happens if Russia miscalculates again, like they did in Ukraine? We can't rely too much on the perception of deterrence. After all, I mean, Russia has shown that it acts irrationally from time to time,
Yeah.
and I think it's also a big risk for us. The world has, or at least now, not only the Russians are becoming less irrational, also the Americans, etc. And it's a kind of a new world where the deterrence that may have worked in the past will not work anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with deterrence, right? It's entirely perception based. You know, two actors look at one situation, and both will necessarily probably, you know, see something either slightly different or very different. So our task is to think about ways and devices that we can use to signal to the Russians as effectively as possible that we will either deny an attack, meaning they will not achieve their military objectives, or that we are able to impose sufficient punishment to make it not worthwhile. I think we can do that, but in the end, right, misperceptions happens, miscalculation happens, meaning that is a risk. I mean, for Ukraine, right? I think or when it comes to the Ukraine war, I think the Russians definitely miscalculated. But then again, I also think the West didn't really do a good job in helping the Russians assess the situation correctly. So I think this is a two-way street, and I think from our side, we just have to do our best to deter the Russians and install the types of perceptions that we want them to have of us, and then we see if it works. And if we do what is needed, I'm quite optimistic that we can do it.
And
But yeah, you never get 100% certainty.
And one of the ways that we could have helped the Russians to understand better that they wouldn't succeed in their plan would have been to demonstrate Ukrainian firepower like we used to do in the Cold War, right? When we had these massive exercises, and then we invited all the Soviet generals and had an enormous fire display at the end of the exercise. That was one of the things that we were doing to kind of demonstrate our power. And also invite the Russians to come and look at our bases stacked full of equipment. I mean, none of these things were happening before 2022.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other comments from the panel? Okay. Well, so I thought I would try and go towards what the Americans have tried to project on Ukraine, basically, and Europe. And we had the Secretary of Defense Hegseth coming with some pretty bold and dramatic statements, and I've picked two. One is the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of negotiated settlement. Instead, security guarantees should be backed by capable European and non-European troops. So then we already have like one of the deterrences that were possible kind of stricken out of any possible future. Of course, he's kind of rolled back on that or put some doubt into that phrase that he said something like nothing is off the table, but this was initially what he said. And then he said, if these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as a part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. And I mean, this basically puts a lot of pressure on Europe. And Zelensky has been prepared for this because even before these statements, he has claimed, or at least tried to communicate, that Ukraine would need a force of around 100 to 150,000 troops. I think he said 125,000 once and 150,000 once. I've never seen him actually saying 100,000, but this was just some media reports that I've cut out, and some media reports have speculated that Europe can basically muster 30 to 40,000 strong force, and none of these figures are really confirmed. But I tried to go in a kind of a middle way, so I assumed 100,000 because I think that is more realistic for deterrence, and even though it's not realistic that we could actually muster this. And one of the things that I don't think a lot of people understand is that, let's say that there is 100,000 strong force on the front lines, because that's what you're talking about, a fighting force. That's what's been mentioned. Then you would have, you wouldn't only need those 100,000 troops, you would need 3 times that figure because of the way we are operating in Western forces, especially at NATO forces. We normally have a rotation basis, which is 1 to 3. So one part is undergoing training and one part is deployed while one part is resting, and then the cycle starts again. That would require at all times 300,000 European and non-European, as they said. But I'm kind of doubtful to the non-European part there. Fighting forces. In addition to that, for that force to be realistically capable of deterring Russian attacks and actually being able to fight if something happens, because I assume that is what Zelensky is basically demanding here. You would need support and logistics personnel in addition to that. And normally we assume something around 1 to 3 there as well. So one part is fighting and 2 parts are in the rear. And even more, actually, that is a very low requirement for support and logistics. And over 18 months, that would muster 900,000 people. But of course, there are some variations in how long a rotation would last for people in logistics and support. Maybe some would be civilian contractors, etc. But would this even be possible, Fabian? That is my question here.
Honestly, not entirely sure if I can give a satisfying answer to that, because in the end I'm not a logistics expert or the type of crowned army expert that you probably would need for that. I look again, right? If I think 300,000 troops for 6 months. That's not impossible.
That would be 300,000, while 100 is in training, 100 is deployed, and 100 is resting. So that's the assumption.
My gut feeling is, right, literally I'm doing here vibes-based analysis, right, as I call it, because I don't have hard data on that. I would say that's not an impossible number. But yeah, for sure it would be extremely challenging. And then if you think about drawing this out, you probably would need more than that. And then it becomes really, really difficult. I also think, again, right, if we do this kind of deployment, especially if the Americans are out and they explicitly say that NATO troops in Ukraine or European NATO troops in Ukraine are not covered by Article 5, that means 100% the Russians are going to challenge that in some way. They're going to do some shenanigans. They're going to escalate in some way. They're going to try and figure out how serious we are. So if we put our men and women there, we then better make sure that they can defend ourselves. And we also have contingency plans in hand, right, that we can bring to bear if need be. So yeah, I mean, the challenge then is beyond those deployed resting and training troops. It's also that we need to have more equipment, material, and manpower ready to respond in case of a certain scenario materializing where Russia escalates drastically.
Yeah, so my assumption in this scenario, and let's say that we start with 100,000 combat troops, right, which means a committed 300,000 strong force. We start out with that, and then we go out to all the different nations that would have to be participating in that. They would then start planning seriously, or actually doing surveys for what is possible to do. At that moment, you would have various intelligence agencies doing risk assessments for those kind of missions. And my assessment is that we will have two very important crucial points where personnel would potentially die or be injured. And one is undetonated ordnance, so UXO, and mines. And I assess that the likelihood of NATO or European forces dying or being injured is almost certain.
Yeah.
And then you have the risk that there would be some sort of flare up of the conflict or targeted attacks that could be even unintentional misunderstandings or intentional. And I think my assessment is that it is very likely to happen in the span of, like, let's say 3 years, which is a very short term. This peacekeeping mission would probably last something like 10 to 15 years minimum, right? So at that point, I assume a lot of European nations would withdraw completely from the whole mission when they realize how likely it is that people will die. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that needs to be a consideration. We all need to be aware that most likely that means NATO men and women will die in Ukraine. Two other considerations that I find quite concerning is that I think it would be quite likely that Russia launches air attacks into NATO. Don't know exactly how deep, but I think Poland or the Baltics are quite likely, perhaps in response to some infringement that they believe we did in Ukraine, right? That they make up, some scenario where we reportedly attacked them, and then they had to respond and punish us by launching missiles into NATO territory. And then we have to be, it has to be very, very clear that if Russia launches missiles into our territory, we launch back at them. I think that has to be a given, that if they attack our homeland, we attack right back. You cannot let that stand. You cannot then be there, oh yeah, but we had air defense in place, and oh, we need more air defense to prevent that in the future. If you do it again, you're all in or not. So then you launch back. And I sometimes wonder, or not sometimes, I wonder very often if we have the decision makers in place to make that decision, right? Again, knowing that this entails risks, but I think not reacting entails greater risks. But I'm not sure if they share this cost benefit analysis. And then the other thing, and this is perhaps the thing I'm almost most concerned about. I mean, in Germany right now, you have what, 20% for the AfD, you have 5% and 5% for the BSW and the Left Party. So that means you have almost 1/3 of voters, maybe 20-25% of society, who very clearly are pro-Russian in their outlook when it comes to Ukraine. That means you have to upkeep this type of deployment against the, at the best case, how can I express it? Negative indifference from a large part of your population. And in the worst case, you will have a significant segment of your society that will work actively against you, both within legal and potentially also illegal spheres, to make your life a lot harder while this already very difficult deployment is ongoing in Ukraine. So yeah, this is it's tremendously challenging, and I find it somewhat frightening. So I still believe, we should do everything to just make sure that the Ukrainians win this, and that the Russians do not get out of this war with some type of victory without being significantly weakened.
Yeah. So when presented with all the risks that this kind of peace mission would come with, I think that the Scholzes and Bidens and other people would be very shocked, because they have been acting assuming that this is less risky than for instance, sending personnel into Ukraine to train or perform air defense tasks or something to that sort, right? Or even sending certain weapon systems. So for me, the equation of also just the cost that this would pose on us, and also probably put quite some difficulties in our own buildup of forces that is for us, because we would have to concentrate enormous amount of effort just to train the people, to plan, to build up logistics, bases. Even this kind of missions you can't have 100,000 people living in tents. You would have to actually build structures and logistics infrastructure as well, and that is extremely costly. And I wonder, are politicians even presented with the costs that this kind of mission would pose on us, and risks, of course?
I wonder if they are presented with the costs, the real costs of Ukrainian defeat in general, right? Or in defeat, including something that necessitates this type of mission. I mean, there's so much on top of that. No, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know how aware they are. I believe if they were fully aware, they would have to act differently, but maybe I'm wrong, right? I start to feel some type of resignation there, because I feel like so many analysts, myself included, have, almost screamed against the wall that there are horrible costs entailed in failing to support Ukraine to the extent that is needed. So they should know, but either they don't or they ignore it.
Understood. Are there any more comments from the panel about this? Okay. I think we saw a couple of questions in chat to you. I have to scroll up. Sorry, I lost it. I lost it. If anyone finds the question that was sent to Fabian, I would like to pose it.
I see the question to Fabian. How would the situation change when Ukraine would have some kind of nuclear deterrence? Ooh,
Yeah,
that nuclear
that
deterrent
would,
is back.
yes.
Oh man, I mean, of course, that would fundamentally change the situation. The question is, A, how likely is it for Ukraine to acquire some type of nuclear deterrent? And B, how likely is it for Ukraine to acquire what we call a robust nuclear deterrent, right? So question one, Ukraine right now, they don't have the means to race for a bomb right at this moment. That means they would have to build up supporting infrastructure that includes in particular plutonium reprocessing plants that would be able, right? So basically, right, the easiest way for Ukraine would be to take some of that plutonium that they get out of their light water reactors, reprocess that to extract the plutonium 239, which you need to. No, sorry, I don't know which isotope it is. I don't know. Anyway, it's just some type of plutonium, right? That you need to get the fissile material, which then will result in the bomb or the warhead. So they would have to build it up. Probably would take like 1 to 2 years. Very, very difficult to hide that. And then also, diverting the plutonium from the nuclear plants towards that secret reprocessing plant, that would not be feasible to hide that from the IAEA and probably also international intelligence services, including Russia. So this would not happen in the dark, but people would know that it would be going on, which means that Russia would probably start launching preemptive attacks against Ukraine's nuclear infrastructure, which would be really bad because a large part of Ukraine's remaining energy comes from its nuclear power plants. They would be bombed and destroyed. So on top of the radiation things that are happening, then you would also mean there would be much more severe energy situation, electricity provision in terms of that. Yeah, so I don't think that's realistic. But let's say even if you say that's somehow realistic and they would get that done, Ukraine would also at best possess a very, very small amount of nuclear warheads and nuclear weapons, and it's not a robust nuclear deterrent. It would be incredibly vulnerable to some type of Russian nuclear or non-nuclear first strike. So it would be a type of minimal credibility nuclear deterrent, which is does it means something. It's not useless, but yeah, it would not be the same as a British or a French submarine-based nuclear deterrent. So I know people. I get that asked all the time now by journalists and just people on Twitter and Blue Sky. How likely is it for Ukraine to get a nuclear weapon, and also for European states? Honestly, if I believe there was a straightforward pathway for either of those actors to do that, European states or Ukraine, I probably advocate for it. I just don't see it happen, unfortunately. I think in Europe, especially, we've been somewhat stupid that we purposefully and systematically reduced our what we call nuclear latency, right? Like the nuclear infrastructure that you would need to build a bomb if you make that decision. We've made incredibly proliferation resistant nuclear infrastructure in Europe, right? Got rid of our heavy water reactors, only built light water reactors. Our reprocessing plants are either very small scale or not available anymore, and we send our plutonium elsewhere for reprocessing, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, incredibly difficult. Not impossible, but yeah, I don't know if we should get too caught up on that.
So I'll ask the question a little bit differently. What if European countries that want to have a European nuclear umbrella over them pay current nuclear powers in Europe to extend that, maybe even leasing or deploying nuclear weapons within armed forces of Europe, like the US have done before?
So the only way that would be anything close to European is if you would have warheads and weapons physically in other member states that also can autonomously and independently use them. If that's not the case, then you have basically the current scenario with forward deployed American nuclear weapons in Europe, right? Where you need to have two keys, one of the state where they're deployed in Europe, so Germany, Italy, Turkey, Belgium, or the Netherlands, and the United States. Or you have the same situation as we have now, minus the Americans, where the French said that they appreciate the vital interests, the vital European interests, which they might defend or which they are willing to defend with their nuclear deterrence. So basically, right, they're implying that their nuclear umbrella is extended over other member states. And as a German or as a Dutch person, a Belgian person, I think that's quite credible, because right, if the Russians get to Berlin or Stuttgart or The Hague or Brussels, there is a good chance they will also make it to Paris. So, right, like an existential threat to these countries probably also means an existential threat to France. But it's very different for the Baltic states or Norway or Finland or Sweden or Romania. So, right, I think there really you get the same issue, that you have to basically trust the French that they will retaliate on your behalf when your existence is threatened, knowing very well that that means that Paris and any other major population hub in France will die in response, even though they're not, existentially threatened at that very moment. So that just inherently lacks credibility. So yeah, that's the option. Like, if you want to have anything akin to a European nuclear deterrent, that means physical warhead location in other member states plus autonomous and independent ability to launch them.
And what are France and the UK's capabilities of providing those weapons, right?
I mean, they could provide the fissile material, for example. If Germany was fully determined to acquire a nuclear capability, arguably they would be the major. So there would be two major, or let's say three hurdles, right? The first one is the biggest one is acquiring the fissile material. And there, the British and the French, they could step in fairly easily. The French better than the British ones because they have a more robust and more robust nuclear program, which is also geared more towards military outputs. So the French, they could just increase, let's say, their plutonium production or plutonium reprocessing, and get a couple dozen critical quantities. Or significant quantities, I think is what the IAEA calls it. So at like a critical mass that you would need for a bomb, so a significant quantity to Berlin. Berlin would then take that and ask a warhead manufacturer, probably TDW, which is the leading missile warhead manufacturer, to create a nuclear device out of that fissile material. Basically, how you would do that is you have like a plutonium sphere. That plutonium sphere needs to be collapsed in on itself. You do that by exploding extremely symmetrically conventional explosives around that sphere. So you compress that sphere, and then the fission process starts, right? That's how you get then the nuclear explosion. So I think TDW or also other types of warhead manufacturers, base systems, right? They also do that, right? So there are probably several manufacturers, but I would say TDW is really primed to do that. They could get that done fairly fast, couple of months if you really wanted to get it done. And then you have to integrate that into a missile system, let's say like Taurus. That's the final barrier or hurdle, and that might take another couple of months. So that what you then need to do is you need to validate the system and rebalance it and blah blah blah. So, but that's not that big of a deal. Really, the biggest hurdle would be to acquire the fissile material. And if France and the UK were determined to provide that to European states, then we're in. then we have more European nuclear powers suddenly, I would say.
And I think that is probably the most likely outcome if we here in Europe assess that the American nuclear umbrella is no longer as strong as it used to be in its in its prime time.
I mean, it would be one thing that would be interesting then is if the Americans would accept it, if they would support it, or if they would actively oppose it, right? If they're either indifferent or supporting, then I think it's not going to say fairly straightforward, but a lot easier. If they actively oppose it, then the economic costs and political costs are going to be tremendous. There's also a danger still, right? That Russia might want to go preemptively after our fledgling nuclear arsenals. I'm not saying they have an international basis, but they might have a basis in international law, but they might have something that approaches that. I mean, Israel, they bombed Osirak in Iraq in 1981, which was a research reactor, which was built for nuclear fissile material production. And then they bombed in, I think, 2012 or 2013, a Syrian nuclear research reactor, which was also supposed to build fissile material. And there was no large-scale condemnation. So I think again, there is no clear international law out there on it. But given that these types of attacks weren't strongly condemned by most of the international community, Russia could probably claim that by conducting these preemptive strikes, nuclear or non-nuclear, well, nuclear would be a different thing, but at least as long as they're non-nuclear, they could claim that they are acting, within the bounds of international law, and they're basically just doing the duty of preventing nuclear proliferation, which many would argue has also become customary international law due to the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, meaning you don't need any more written in law and being part of a treaty that you say nuclear proliferation is illegal. So even if then Germany or Norway or any other European state would step out of the non-proliferation treaty, right, they could still make the argument fairly effectively, I would say, that no, nuclear proliferation is still illegal because it's a customary international law, and there is a legal basis in preemptively going after emerging nuclear arsenals. So we're acting within international law, and hence we're doing it. And they might also get support for that internationally from China, India. I think that is something we would have to be fully aware of.
That's another point of how complicated our future is if we don't act now, if we don't let Ukraine handle this, and also make sure that they are more capable than now of defending themselves. So I think all the things that you mentioned, it makes my head kind of explode, because if you combine that with all the added risks of not deterring Russia on the ground in Ukraine, it is a very messy scenario in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Just seeing some comments, I'm just, I mean, I'm not invoking international law because I'm saying it's illegal and oh no, we need to be law-abiding states. I said that, I brought up that point because that's something that Russia will say, right? Russia will do these kinds of strikes and attacks they will justify it by reference to international law. And we have to then also be prepared that the international community, like China, like India, potentially also the United States, who knows, that they will be behind that, right? That they will say, no, look, that was a fair thing to do by Russia. Right? It doesn't mean that we shouldn't go down that route if we decide to do that. It's just, again, something that we have to be aware of. This is I'm trying to say, like, get the full picture. Don't try to paint a reality where this is easy and we just get it done and nothing will happen. Russia will not just stand by and watch us go nuclear. There will be something happening. Again, doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I definitely see a scenario where this could be worthwhile and beneficial. But yeah, get the full picture and make the decision based on that.
Yeah, thank you. So last topic would be, and I think Colby can help us a little bit here as well. If the US is fairly passive in its support of Ukraine militarily, let's assume that they will only sell equipment to Ukraine or European allies that will then provide them to Ukraine. Do you think that Europe is able to provide what it takes for the next 1 to 2 years to outlast Russia? Because that's in my time scale what I believe Russia is able to continue, how long they are able to continue this war. We don't need to go into the attrition rates, etc. We can do that another time. That's probably a whole hour of stream just to talk about the attrition rates. But do we have what it takes? And I think both Fabian and Colby can answer to that.
Yeah. Colby, do you want to go first? And then I add some points maybe.
Sure. So I would say that, yes, theoretically at least, Europe has the capacity. Europe is collectively is a larger economy than Russia is. Europe has the industrial base. It's just not been activated. And this has been you've heard this from myself and Fabian constantly for 3 years, that European governments have just not activated their existing industrial capabilities. And there's been very lackluster investment into upgrading capabilities or building out new capabilities. And this isn't to say that nothing's been done, because obviously things have been done. You see myself tweeting about it all the time about new factories that are coming online and increases in material production. But these are all still very modest increases in the grand scheme of things. No really massive expansions have happened anywhere. And the bigger ones are typically in some of the smaller countries. France, Germany, UK, a lot of the biggest economies have still been putting fairly modest amounts into their defense industrial bases relative to what they could be doing. And there are legitimate reasons for this, namely the EU's rules on deficit spending, which are just severely constraining governments' abilities to make those investments without making cuts or raising taxes, which obviously governments seldom want to do. But this is the problem confronting Europe, is that European governments are just not matching their rhetoric with their actions. They say that what's happening in Ukraine is an existential question for not just Ukraine, but for Europe as a whole. And obviously this is true, but that language for 3 years now has still not been matched by tangible actions. And here we are 3 years later, and the EU is only now finally having a somewhat serious conversation about exempting defense investments from those deficit rules that the EU has. And that is something that should have happened 3 years ago. So a lot of time has been wasted. And had that time not been wasted, then Europe would be, for the most part, fairly sufficient in its ability to provide Ukraine's war material requirements without American support, with few exceptions. I mean, Europe, the only thing that Europe probably couldn't do is ballistic missiles, and even then, like 3 years, I mean, Europe could have spun up a ballistic missile program, probably. Conventional ballistic missile program in that time, or be close to fielding one. But Europe already has cruise missiles. They've just chosen not to produce them. Europe produces pretty much everything else that Ukraine needs. It's all just on a very small scale. So it's going to be challenging, no doubt, if the United States stops providing any assistance on their own initiative. Arms sales are going to still be on the table, as I've said consistently. I don't think that that's going to be taken off the table. The United States is not going to turn down money if there's willing buyers. But if the United States just stops drawdown, stops making their own new security commitments, it will certainly be challenging for Europe because they aren't, production is just not on a level where it needs to be to fulfill all of Ukraine's needs. But if they can get this the deficit rule changed, then that'll certainly be helpful. But they've wasted a lot of time, and it's going to take time, if they come to an agreement on that, for the money to start flowing into making investments that are needed and getting those new factories stood up. So it will be a challenge, but ultimately I think that Europe, as I said, will still have the option of buying things from the United States. Whatever they can't deliver on their own, they can either buy from the United States, they can continue to buy ammunition on the global market. There's the Czech initiative. There are other countries that have actively been doing this for some time as well, just quietly. So there's lots of options that can still be tapped to get the material that Ukraine needs, but it's certainly going to stress resources, no doubt. And just at the end of the day, European governments need to be willing to step up and put their money where their mouths are, because they haven't been doing that. And it's just, if European governments want a seat at the quote unquote table, you have to bring something to the table. And we all understand that Europe has done quite a lot for Ukraine so far, but still far, far, far below what they need to, given the existential threat that we've been talking about for an hour and a half now, and what is in Europe's future should Ukraine lose. Obviously, this is an extremely, extremely small price to pay relative to what the cost would be if Europe would have to actually fight a war with Russia on their own. So it's a very, very small price, but that price has still been too big for pretty much most governments in Europe to agree to spend that small price for 3 years now. And now we're at the point where Europe has no option. They either change their policy direction, or, the unthinkable scenarios that Fabian and yourself have been speaking about for an hour now, that's going to be realized.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think what we've been seeing, and especially these last 6 months, I think has become quite apparent, at least to me, that almost any expansion, pretty much, I would say probably over 90% of the expansion and production capacity that we've seen was led by the manufacturers themselves. So there was really almost no direct government support in Europe, and this had the result that you've seen an expansion in non-capital intensive industries, right? Like in the beginning, we said, for example, that quantum systems and Helsing, like, they ramp up their production constantly. And that's because these lightweight drones and shorter range drones, I'm not saying it's cheap to produce them, but you don't need that upfront capital in creating these massive manufacturing halls and precision manufacturing machines and whatnot, right? The things that you need to build more complex, larger systems. And I think what European states really need to do, they now need to go to those manufacturers and really ask them what they need to ramp up production, right? And one thing is, multi-year contracts, as the United States has done, in peacetime for years and years now. That's not really a thing in Europe, with the exception of some very, very minor programs. You might want to subsidize directly, right? Manufacturers increasing production capacities. Again, something the US has done for ages now. I think just last year they awarded $260 million or something to Williams International to build more turbofan engines for JASSM-ER. That's just money they get on top of what they invest themselves to ramp up production. Or literally, you just tell the manufacturer, look, we gonna build you the fucking excuse my language, we're gonna build you the goddamn manufacturing hall, and you just fill them with people, and we help you get the machines and whatnot ready so you can ramp up production, right? And then you also talk to those workers' councils in those manufacturing facilities that will tell you that they can't work three shifts in a day, right? And you ask them, hey, what do you need to get that done, right? Do you need more safety officers? Do you need more money, right? Do the people need to be paid more? How can we help you to get this done? But we're really at this point in Europe now, I feel like, where we have to find solutions for that, right? And we have to break out of our traditional ways of doing things when it comes to the defense industry, because clearly this has not helped us ramp up production to the extent that it's needed.
Yeah, just to add to this, so it's a bit of a misconception that Europe's arms industry overall is much more state-owned than the United States' arms industry. But despite that, there's still this severe problem where European governments are not willing to make these investments, as Fabian's saying, into industrial base expansion. But the United States is. The United States government owns a handful of different plants, mostly in munitions production, and they operate a very small number of those on their own, and then the rest are operated by contractors. And these plants get a lot of money invested into them by the US government. And in Europe, this is much more challenging, it seems, that a lot of these state-owned, either entirely or partially state-owned firms in Europe, a lot of them are just not getting capital either from the government or from institutional lenders. And again, there's lots of reasons for this. EU regulations around banking and ESG policies as well have been extremely detrimental to the ability of the defense industry in Europe to raise private capital, which is a problem that doesn't exist to the same extent in the United States. And again, this is something that needed to change 3 years ago, and here we are. And Europe is only really still having conversations about these things. Still, a lot of the action has not been taken. So it's easy, again, because so much of the industry is state-owned. It's not even that you have these private companies that are being very intransigent. As Fabian says, a lot of them have just invested their own money, or whatever expansions they've been able to do is just as a result of them getting contracts. And again, a lot of these contracts are from foreign purchasers as well. It's not even related to Ukraine. And then people wonder why there's still so much war material being produced in Europe that is not going to Ukraine or not going to Europe's own needs. Well, it's because European governments are not buying the war material from their own industry. They are just reliant on their limited export business to keep themselves afloat because they don't get money from their own countries. So this is something that needs to change, and it could change very quickly. And I've pointed this out on Twitter that Italy is a good example of what we might see if the deficit rule is changed. That the Italians have been saying very publicly that they will invest considerably if that rule was changed. So they're the ones to watch whether they come through on that. I suspect they probably will, but you never know. That's my approach is always wait and see. But the Italian government owns a considerable portion of Italy's defense industrial base, and it'll be very easy for them to start pumping money into it if they can exempt deficit spending from into defense, is if it's exempted from those rules. So there's a very easy framework here to make these investments happen if they are allowed by the EU. And again, I just can't stress enough that this needed to change 3 years ago, and it's imperative that they do this as soon as possible because Ukraine is obviously running out of time.
I think the ASAP program was very interesting, but unfortunately, we should have seen 10 to 15 similar projects, not just on 155 munitions, right? And the programs themselves should have probably been a lot larger. I think that in combination with changing the depth rules can probably really boost European defense manufacture. And I think, yes, Italy is a very good example. A lot of these companies that are either state-owned or partially state-owned have tried to get investment, both from Italy and from through the ASAP program, etc. But the Italian government was not very happy about the ASAP program for some reason, so they didn't let the companies apply for it. That's very sad, because Italy has a very, very good base of being quite a big powerhouse in defense manufacturing in Europe. But I think that a lot of countries would jump on that bandwagon, right? It wouldn't just be Italy.
Yeah, no, and thank you for mentioning the ASAP program. This slipped my mind, because this is a perfect example of the problem that I'm talking about here. Because the ASAP program was 500 million euros, which is obviously nothing. Like, that's like it's peanuts. The United States has invested basically 10 times that amount into their munitions industrial base. We're talking like in the magnitude of $5 billion, probably more now. So the fact that the EU just could only come up with only $500 million across the entire European bloc to invest in the industrial capacity of the munitions industrial base, like, this is a joke. As you said, like, it needs to be way more than that. The EU should have been investing on the same magnitude as the United States, and if they had done that, then we would see that the EU would be able to produce drastically more ammunition right now. Because the EU is saying that they maybe 2 million rounds of large caliber will be produced this year. So that figure would be way higher if the ASAP program was 10 times bigger, which it should have been. So that's the kind of investment that was needed, again, 3 years ago, and they can't afford to waste another day, basically, because there's a lot of facilities that either got like a very small amount of money, because, again, 500 million divided by countless different projects, so everybody was basically getting a few bucks from the EU. So countless different facilities, factories, companies that only got a couple of bucks or didn't get any money at all, because they didn't even bother to bid because it wasn't worth their time, or they just didn't get selected. So there's a lot of untapped potential on the continent that is just starved of capital. And if they got that capital, they could start increasing production and delivering more war material to Ukraine and to their own militaries.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're going to wrap up, but I think I want to ask Fabian about one last thing. Let's assume that all this fails. Europe doesn't really continue to provide a whole lot, and the US also kind of stops providing most of the equipment that it is providing right now to Ukraine. How long do you think Ukraine can fight, or do you think they can continue to fight at all?
Well, they can fight for a long time, I would say. I mean, as long as Europe stays in there and supports them, then they have a lifeline. And I think Russia is very much unable to create either operational or let alone strategic level breakthroughs. So I think that would, I don't think the front line would crumble and Ukraine would simply have to give up. I don't think. I think the thing for Ukraine is, and I've tried to make that clear on Twitter and also in some op-eds I wrote over the last few days. Ukraine will not lose that war because it is forced to surrender due to military exhaustion. I think if Ukraine decides to give up, that's a political decision, right? And they believe that the costs of continued resistance outweigh the costs of the settlement that would be imposed on them. So, right, then it's really up to the Ukrainians to decide when that point is reached. And I, of course, really, really hope that we stay in there with them for as long as it takes and make sure that they understand that as long as they are in the fight, we are with them, and that they can make a decision based on that. But yeah, I think in any case, with us or without us, with the US or without the US, I don't think this war will be decided because one side is fully unable to continue to resist. I think in the end, this will come down to a political decision.
Yeah, I think that was good final words. Joseph, do you have any comments or final words? And also Colby. It seems pretty quiet. My final words will be that it probably is going to cost Europe a hell lot more to not fully commit to Ukraine and let it continue its fight. As they say themselves, they would like to defend their territories, and we should let them. If they decide politically that they want to settle down, then we have to support that as well. But until then, I don't see any reason for why we should either even start to approach what has been presented this week from the Americans. And I think that a lot of the dooming around that messaging is not necessarily warranted, because as lined out here, Europe really can do this if we want to, right? Joseph, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, so I think we published a new article on the website, right?
Is it published already?
Maybe I should be quiet then.
Well, there is an article coming. It's not yet out, but it's almost done. And I think there's kind of a series of articles that are gonna come out, or at least a couple more, because we've been doing quite some research on a project that I'm helping Daniela with, and some other people. But one of those articles are basically in the approval rate. I think proofreading is the stage where it is at this moment.
Gotcha. Well, look forward to that. Check out Tochnyi.info. It's the old website. Check out all the great research that our team does. So yeah, I want to thank our panel first. I want to thank our special guest, Fabian. Thanks so much for coming on and talking to us about a very important topic. You're welcome on anytime, of course. Thank you, of course, to our panel, Mr. Colby, Mr. Erlend, Terminate to Ukraine, who's, I guess, watching a debate right now, but is with us in spirit. And of course, thanks to live chat for coming and asking all the great questions. We always appreciate that. And the guests always mention they like your guys' questions. So good job as always. And thanks to the people who watch the video on demand. We appreciate you guys. We know not everyone can make it to 2100 Kyiv, as we broadcast every Sunday at 2100 Kyiv time. But if you can't make it, you can always watch the pre-recorded stuff. And yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see everyone next week. Slava Ukraini.
Heroim Slava.
On behalf of the brave.